David asks if I could talk about debugging strategies when creating custom blocks. Sure. You know, when we build something like the contact information block, it's a pretty simple block, so we didn't have to do too much debugging. But a lot of concrete5 happens within Ajax, and so it can be kind of difficult to figure out what's going on when you're submitting stuff and something's not working. So, for example, let's say I don't actually have to have a save argument because all of this block is so simple. It just saves its parameters directly to database table found in this protected variable here. But if I did and something was going wrong, I could add in this. So what this will do is it will log this save and dump out all the arguments that are going into the save function prior to calling parent save. So let's say that I do sidebar contact information. And I choose a thumbnail. And I submit add. Everything goes in as normal. It shows up in the sidebar. But if I go into logs in my reports section of the dashboard, you'll see that I now have a new log in there of the debug type. And this is what is added when I just call log add entry. You can do more. You can do more interesting stuff if you take a look at the log class or the log model. You can set the different type so that a new type shows up here, and you can filter by certain types. You can write in successive sessions as opposed to just adding one entry. You can open a log, write to it over a few different requests, and it will show up all in one entry and then close it. But this is by far the most common thing that we do is add entry here. And so now you can see this is the entire content of the arguments that got passed to the logging function. And that that is pretty valuable when you're working with a lot of Ajax. We will definitely that's a pretty common thing that we reference. We have a number of, there's not a lot of logging done in concrete5 by default, but even on our own site or in custom code that we've written, if there are certain things that we know go wrong but it's really hard to reproduce, we will just add in a log statement for that particular portion when the exception gets thrown or something along those lines, and then we will go to the logs periodically and see if we can find instances of that happening so that we can better deduce what's going on. Brant asks, how would you go about allowing regular users to add tags inline without the pop-up WYSIWYG that I'd see in editing mode? For something along these lines, you would probably have to build something like you'd either give them editing rights and just trust that they could figure out how to use the concrete5 editing toolbar and use advanced permissions to lock down exactly which blocks they could add to different areas, or make it so they couldn't add any block at all, but they could edit blocks that already existed. Other than that, I would probably say you'd have to create some custom editing interfaces using single pages. So, for example, that example FAQ add-on is run from within the dashboard, but there's nothing stopping it from, you could install that, you could tweak that package and make it install just, excuse me, off the root of your site as opposed to in the dashboard. And all of a sudden what you've done there is you've made it so that anyone could add an example FAQ entry, and then they could edit them as well. And then you could lock that down to only registered users as opposed to anyone. And then since that's a custom interface, you have complete control over the types of editors you display to them, and then, but behind the scenes, those editors could still be creating blocks on a page that could be edited through the CMS by an administrator. So a good example of this is the how-to section on our own site. Any registered user can create a how-to, and it's a series of form fields. And behind the scene, and that's all powered through a single page on our site that gives the form fields. And when you submit it, it creates a page on the back end, adds blocks and attributes to that page. And then if the person edits their own how-to, they don't edit it through the CMS main interface, but there's a single page that grabs that data and populates the form again with the edit versions of the data. So that's what I would do for that. I would build a single page editing interface for that stuff. Dan asks about the block versus attribute question. The main reason I ask is when you want to query a list of pages based on something that's displayed on the page. For instance, I want a list of employee pages based on job title. Typically it'd be easier to edit that title in the block, but it seems difficult to query. Yeah, that would be a little interesting. You know, it would be, but if you're writing your own custom code, you could just as easily pull the first block in the main area and grab its content and pass that. I mean, it's not quite as syntactically simple as pulling a title based on get attribute, but it's pretty easy to use the concrete5 API to get all the blocks in an area, only grab the first one, and get the content of it. So I think for that, I'd recommend trying something along the lines of, I'd create a page title block, which when you changed it in the page, also changed the attribute at the page level, and then use your custom code to filter by the page title at the page level. Yeah, I'd create a custom block to do that, and then once you did that, you'd be able to filter by whatever title your page had. Jamie asks, when doing a custom template, how does the override know to use the view.css in the custom template? Well, there is a very complicated library in the libraries folder called blockViewTemplate.php, and there's just many different sort of permutations that we have and test for that basically know where to look. So if you're basically the rule is if your custom template is a folder, we will look for the view.php file within the folder, and then any view files found within that folder, view.js, view.css, we will add to the header. So the answer is that's just how it works, and it looks. And that actually, just to clarify, those view files or those CSS and JavaScript files, they actually get added into the header of the site. They don't get added inline. So if you're concerned about your markup having CSS files and JavaScript files strewn all over the place, you don't have to be worried about that so much. Those things get added within the header of the head tag of the site where they are supposed to. And Tom asks, could you briefly cover the concept of stacks? Sure, that's actually a new feature since before I actually wrote this, or a new feature that came about after we wrote this lesson plan. So probably should be updated to include stacks. For those who know or perhaps don't know, Um, the concrete version, I believe 5.2, 5.3 introduced the concept of scrapbooks, and we improved upon that concept and sort of normalized it and ironed out a lot of the kinks with the concept of stacks in version 5.5. And stacks are basically hidden pages in your site that hold blocks. So if I go into the stack section of my site, you can see there's this stack called side nav. In here, I have two different blocks added. One is just a title, links, and the other is an auto nav, which shows pages at the second level. And so if I go into, let me see if I can find one that actually has this. I may have removed that page. If I go into the About page, you can see I have links, contact us, guestbook, this is my question. If I click here, this is not actually this is a block, but it's not really like other blocks. This is a block that references a stack. And so if I click Manage Stack Contents, it takes me over to the dashboard where I can add blocks to my stack. So stacks are ways of grouping up a list of blocks and then referencing them either programmatically or through the site on different pages. So if I add a file to this stack, you'll notice I get an Approve Changes. If I click Approve and then go back to my About page, Download Cool Photograph now shows up at the bottom of my stack, and anywhere else that stack is referenced. And one thing that makes stacks pretty cool is that you can, since these are all, you can actually move stuff around without, and it will be globally updated throughout the site. So that was always a problem for us when dealing with sort of centralized content. Stacks make it a lot easier to understand kind of what's going on. And they also facilitate a cool new function in concrete5 version 5 called global areas. So you'll notice as I navigate the site, I have, let's say I wanted to do something like I wanted to change how my menu looked, and I wanted to change this test that showed up in the left-hand side of my site. Say I wanted to change it to an image. Well, if I click Edit here, it says this block is contained within a global area. Changing its content will change it everywhere that global area is referenced. That's because in my theme, in my header element, I have this PHP. Instead of area, I have global area, and then I display it, and I don't even have to pass a page object to it. Same way with header nav. You could do this in the footer as well for like a global copyright statement. And what happens behind the scenes when you add a global area PHP call to your template, it creates a stack in the back end that you could then add content to. But global areas are cool because you can actually change them on the front end of your site. So if I got rid of this, actually I'll just add a block to this. If I publish my edits, you'll see I can swap out my my test with something that's a lot, with a logo for my company or something along those lines. And now, since it's a global area, anywhere I navigate on my site, the test has been replaced by the logo. So that's kind of what stacks are all about. They you can get you can get the blocks that are in stacks pretty easily. We are still sort of refining them. So in a future version of Concrete 5, right now, if you click on a sidebar and you click Add Stack, you can add the entire stack. So if you click Side Nav, you'll see I've added an instance of that stack to the left sidebar. But I can't add just a block from within a stack, and that's something we will. That was we initially thought that we actually initially didn't realize how many people were using scrapbooks to, you know, kind of they pull a particular block from within a scrapbook. So just one block as opposed to many things. So since we didn't realize that, we made it so you could add a stack, and that was pretty. That helps for, if you have one thing that has multiple blocks in it that you always want to keep together, you can do that today. But we're going to be adding back the ability to choose one block from a stack as opposed to picking everything. Brant asks, what do you think about wrapping Concrete 5 with a mobile framework with PhoneGap to make a native app, in the sense that PhoneGap exposes you to native-only functionality via JS API? Yeah, it'd be super cool. We haven't really done a ton of work on that kind of stuff before, although uh, we have spent some energy on working on mobile stuff for Concrete 5. I do know that there is something in the marketplace which may or may not play with that type of stuff. I don't think it does everything that does. Hmm. Hmm. Well, I can't seem to locate it, but there is if you take a look through the marketplace, someone has built a sort of mobile application. Maybe it's in the themes. Mobile app. A fully featured mobile web app theme to replicate the look and performance of a native iPhone app. I might take a look at that. It's a bit, it's fairly, it's a bit advanced, but that might be something that would be interested in looking at. A fair amount of these guys are are responsive. A lot of these themes are responsive. Yes. Typically, though, like many of the most recently added mobile themes, and even if themes aren't specifically mobile, they lots of them have responsive. Lots of them have responsive templates. David wonders, I don't see the reasoning behind needing a stack of blocks. What does a stack solve? Well, I mean, other than uh, basically, the global areas, uh, they help with stack. They kind of require stacks because we wanted the blocks to be available at sort of one canonical place and then be referenced in different spots of the tree. And that's kind of what stacks solve, is this idea that I may want to provide centralized copies of blocks which then get referenced throughout the site in different ways. So, for example, a client of ours wanted mega menus on their site in different sections of their site that they could edit. But beyond that, these menus had to be the same on every page of the site, so they didn't want to edit them on every page. We needed one spot for them to be able to edit them through the UI, but then we wanted to be able to call them programmatically on every page. And stacks work well for this because you can create a mega menu stack, add the block in there. They can edit it through the UI in the dashboard. You can lock it down with permissions the same way you edit anything else. But then in your templates, you can retrieve the blocks programmatically through calling on the stack by name, and then you can display them the same way that you almost the same way you display an area. And well, let's see. I think at this point I've covered pretty much everything that the training is meant to cover. So I'd be happy to take some more questions for 10 minutes or so. Oscar asks, can you in a block check for other instances of the same block type? Yeah, you could. It would be kind of, I'm actually, in terms of how you would do that in the API, you definitely can, because I know this is possible, because if you actually look at the block types page in the dashboard and you click on sidebar contact information, you can see this usage count shows that there are two instances of that block. So I can't remember exactly what the API call is for that, but what I would do is I would look in the block types model here. So the block type object, if we look at our attributes test tool, we can show how this works. Get by handle. So this BT object is now the block type object for the contact information block. And if I look in here, there's probably some useful functions that will get us to what you're looking for. If not, you can always query the database directly, but we don't recommend doing that from within a tool. We recommend creating a model to do this, just because it's nicer to do. So this gets the number of unique instances of the block, the get count function. But to actually get a list of all the instances, I feel like you can. So here is how the delete function does this. It queries the database directly and returns all the different blocks found on the different pages, and then it creates block objects for each one, and then it deletes them, which of course you wouldn't want to do. But this is directly from this is directly through the database. There's probably be a cleaner way to do this through the API, but it doesn't actually look like we do this that frequently. So what you'd probably want to do is use this as a starting point and populate an array of all the different blocks that you wanted to look at. Tom asks, if I have a single page with my own code on and I want to run some Ajax, where would you say is the best place to put the Ajax code? Right now I've just used code on another single page which is set to use a completely blank template, but I think you mentioned running files and tools. You know, either this is, we've done it a couple different ways. Historically, a lot of the times we'll use tools because they have a pretty light, like they don't display anything, they don't display any content um, other than what is supposed to be, other than what you explicitly say. There's no view or anything. So for example, if this tool, let me rename it so that it makes a little more sense. If this were called Ajax response in the tools directory, you could, you know, you could process the post in here, if post foo, that type of thing, and then you could create a PHP object, response equals true, message, the block, the content was edited successfully, and then you could do something like helper JSON and code object. And what this does is it will then, if I access this stuff directly, since I didn't actually pass in foo as my request, I don't get any response at all. But if I say foo equals 1, I get standard JSON back, and then you can reference that in your using jQuery super easily. So you'll notice a lot of the times in our core tools directory, we actually have a fair amount of things that we reference in this way. Like I believe get data is a good example here. This is retrieving data about a file, and it sets up an array through JSON with all this different stuff, and it encodes that, and the file manager uses that to display stuff based on JSON, and then we parse that using jQuery. However, you could definitely do it using another single page, but if you didn't want that to show up in your sitemap or in your search, it might be a little bit unwieldy. One thing that you could do that we do a lot now is you could use a controller method for the single page that you're looking at. And this is a little outside the scope of what we're talking about here, is using MVC controllers with your single page. So a controller that is a script that runs, it basically just runs when your single page is rendered. What you can do there is you can create a controller method that is for your Ajax request, and then if you run that, you can just print out within that controller method some JSON or something along those lines, and then just exit at the end of your controller method. I'm trying to think of something that might do that. For example, in Composer, which is our sort of built-in way of like sort of bringing blogging to concrete5, if I start writing a blog entry in Composer, if I wait a second, I will see page saved at 12:29 p.m. And what's happening there is, this is all just a dashboard page. If I look for autosave, I am submitting via Ajax. I'm submitting a form via Ajax in JSON, and if I find this, it is submitting to a action called save. And if I look in my Composer controller, whoops, that's the wrong one. You can see all the way down here at the bottom of my save function, I'm checking to see whether this was an autosave. If it is, that means it's done by JavaScript, and we're not refreshing the page. We just need to show when it was last saved. And so we create a new standard class that shows the time, the current time when this save actually took place, and then we print out the JSON there right from the function, and then we exit. And since this is happening through JSON or through Ajax in the background, it just works like that. Anyone else have any questions? Brant asks, how are you guys so awesome? Well, that would probably take a completely separate 2.5 to 3 hour training to really get through. But thanks, Brant. David asks about caching if we have time, and sure, yeah, we can go through that. Sure. Caching in concrete5 works on a couple different levels. There is a global caching. In general, the idea behind caching is that we, since concrete5 does a lot of different stuff, it can hit a database pretty hard with a lot of different queries. So what we try and do to minimize that is store some of those objects in a faster access in a cache to as opposed to always have to hit the database for all that stuff. And by default, those objects are stored in the file system. There are different cache layers, most of which are faster than the file system, but we default to the file system because it's the one that requires the least configuration. So if you are running a site with any kind of traffic, I would recommend looking at perhaps a different caching layer like APC or memcached D. And then cache and speed settings is within the system and settings section of the dashboard, and this kind of controls the global caching settings for your site. The first one is kind of a universal constant. If you turn this off, there will be no caching. You'll hit the database completely, but on the plus side, there will never be any weird times when you're making changes and you think to yourself, I swore I just updated that block. Why hasn't it taken? And that's actually kind of useful because there are lots of different caching settings now in concrete5 in order to try and maximize performance. So certain blocks, for example, can cache their output for a particular period of time if they think that they can get away with it. That contact information block is a good example, since it, once it rebuilds the cache every time it is edited, but other than that, it stores its output in a special spot that can be retrieved without having to hit the database, which is all well and good. But if you find yourself working on custom templates or anything of that nature, you're going to want to be able to make changes to the PHP code and then refresh the page. And if you have your cache on, it's not going to work. So turning that off while you're developing can be helpful. Full page caching is a little different. Full page caching works by taking the entire contents of a page, all the HTML, and storing that in a cache entry that is retrieved before any database processing of that page takes place. So if you think your home page is going to get hit a lot, or any page of your site is going to get hit for a lot, you could pretty quickly, you could turn on full page caching. Full page caching does not turn on for anyone who is logged in. At some point, we may make that a little bit less granular a setting because that is kind of limiting. But since the full page caching and the edit bar do not work, it is currently off on this page. But if I sign out and I visit these pages, it takes one visit to really prime it because it has to build that cache. But now you'll notice that when I click through these pages, they're pretty fast. Now again, if I make a change using the edit bar to that page, that will update the cache. So the next time someone sees it, it's going to be updated. But if you have any full page caching is not always desirable if you have any kind of dynamic content on your page. For example, if I'm submitting my form and I submit it, there may be a problem. This form knows that it can't do full page caching when it is being posted to. So that's why you're able to show this, please correct the following errors. But sometimes if you have a survey on the page, for example, and you want to allow an anonymous user to vote on a page and then see their results, unless if you have full page caching on, you're just going to see the survey and they're not going to be able to vote because it's cached and the survey is cached and the page has only one view state, the one that has the survey on it in the form. So full page caching is definitely something that can significantly lighten the load on a busy server, but it's one that you'd probably want to. I wouldn't necessarily do it without thinking through all the ramifications of what you're doing. Oscar asks if we could talk a little bit about the config versus tables, and I think what he's talking about is the config class is a model in concrete5 that's a lightweight place to store key-based data. So if you, for example, all of these settings that I've been working with, like public profiles, if I click Enable Public Profiles and click Save, turn that off, that has to save that data somewhere. There isn't a massive database table or there isn't a tiny database table that is public profile settings with only one column in it because it just seemed kind of redundant. Plus, there's hundreds of options that we have to store throughout the site, and this is kind of a recurring problem. Is this idea that we need a place to store preference data, and that is what the config class does. So if we actually look at the controller behind the system registration profiles, you can see that when we're saving that enable user profile settings, we are running a method called config save, and we are passing it a key and a value. And that's basically what this does. The config class is a way of storing one-off keys persistently. So, as you install more packages and things like that, you can have a config class that stores, that has hundreds of settings in it. But with caching enabled, we request all those settings at runtime, and then we reference them through PHP very quickly. So you're not querying 100 times in order to get that data. So that's kind of what I would do config-wise. If you have any kind of relation, if your data is in any way relational, or you need to store multiple bits of data that relate to each other, I guess in the same table versus with a primary key, I would store, if you have any need to store more than just a value next to a key that you know is going to be useful to you, I would write my own database queries. But if you're storing sort of preferences like what type of toolbar do I use here, or am I turning this setting on, preference data that is globally persistent, I would definitely use the config class for that. I don't really have too much more time to go into the attachments, mostly because we don't really have a lot of concrete5 core code that deals with it. But I would check out the Zend framework mail class. Is it possible to, Oscar asks, is it possible to add a custom login page for different groups? Will permissions and advanced permissions become a bit more user-friendly and extended? Um, and then another question I will get to shortly. Um, yeah, you can add multiple login pages. We've done this in different sites. Basically, you could create login a single page that when you submit the username and password that you're trying to submit, not only checks to see if that's a valid user, but whether that user is in a particular group. Um, and then that lets you create different branded landing pages or things like that. Um, there's a lot that goes into the login page if you actually look at the login controller in the core, but a lot of that stuff you wouldn't need. A lot of that stuff is built because is complex because of the way that the core has lots of different settings. And if you're building your own login page, you can kind of make those assumptions as opposed to having to look at all our core settings. And as far as will permissions and advanced permissions become a bit more user friendly, yes, that is something that we are adding for the next major release of Concrete 5. We initially planned to have it released uh, pretty quickly, but instead we've been just trying to iron out and get the current versions really, really stable and bug-free. So that's why we released 5.5.2.1 just recently. But the next major release of Concrete 5 is going to have a completely different advanced permissions interface. So not only more granular roles in terms of who can do what, but the ability to say only users in multiple groups of certain types can do certain things. This user can't do this on this page, and plus the ability to really customize how long certain permissions are active, and even set recurring roles, recurring dates to those permissions. So to be able to feature certain blocks of content on the home page that show up only on the weekends, that type of thing. As far as uh, I think if you have a print page block that uses config, I don't think I would do it with tables. I think I would. Um, I mean, if you wanted to actually make a block that uh, saved data in its own block database table, I would highly recommend taking a look at the how to build a block type how to on the site, or maybe getting training in the basic block development. It's really easy for a developer to make a block that writes data to a database table. So if I actually search for block in the how-to section and or block type. Creating a new block type. It's one of the oldest ones we have. Um, this talks a bit about how to make a block that saves data in the database. Currently, and finally, I think this will probably be our last question. David Workman asks, currently, do you handle multilingual sites with groups or completely different sites? It's kind of we do not handle them with groups. If you take a look at our marketplace, there's a free add-on called internationalization. Internationalization. Um, that is basically this is how we would recommend architecting and setting up a multilingual site. So what we do is instead of actually setting up multiple sites, we set up different we set up different home pages for the multilingual sections beneath a particular site. So, let's get in the demo. So this is it looks like somebody's been working on this. So for a shared multilingual site, your sitemap would look something like this. Home in the English tree would look like this, but actually I guess we're in the Czech language, but every page in a particular section of the site can relate to other pages in a different language tree. So, and then once that page exists, you can translate it into the new page that into the language it's supposed to be in. And we just basically the tools are all, it's all in one site. The tools are all exactly the same, but we add on some internet or some interface to make it easy to understand that you're actually dealing with different sites or different pages in different sites, and then we let you copy languages from one tree to the next. So you could have a completely finished English section of the site, and then you could create all the different language trees at different sections of your site and copy the English out to the Dutch section of the site, and then run a report telling me saying, show me all the pages that are found in the German section of the site that are not found in the Dutch section of the site. And since that doesn't actually appear to have any. But that's how this works. So I would definitely take a look at that one. I think at this point I'm going to have to wrap this up. But thank you everybody for all your questions and for taking this training. I imagine we'll have new ones scheduled pretty soon. You can always sign up directly from the training section of concrete5.org, and there's a bunch of different trainings in there. And yeah, thank you guys for checking this out.